Welcome to the Politics and Public Finance Podcast, in-depth conversations that bring unique insights into the nexus between how governments manage our finances and the work of elective representative bodies such as parliaments. You're listening to Politics and Public Finance Podcast with Jeff Dubrow.
Welcome to Politics and Public Finance. I'm here with the Honourable Shawn Murphy, a former Member of Parliament and Chair of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts of the House of Commons Canada, and Carol Bellringer, who is the President and CEO of the Canadian Audit and Accountability Foundation, and the former Auditor-General of the provinces of British Columbia and Manitoba. We've got some great segments today on the show. We're going to be talking about combating sexual harassment in the military, which obviously has been an ongoing problem in Canada. There was a report, as you would know, there was a report that was released last week by Justice Arbour on this subject. And we're going to be talking about whether parliamentary oversight can actually make a difference. Then we're going to sort of continue with that parliamentary oversight theme and look at the results of the Open Budget Survey, which is a survey of 120 countries from around the world and how they performed on the budget. Not only on the approval of the budget, but through the entire budget process. And the problem is that this year was that Canada's score was absolutely abysmal. And we're going to look into why that was that Canada has slipped so low on the Open Budget Survey. So we'll be talking to Professor Marie-Soleil Tremblay from the École nationale d'administration publique, the University of Public Administration, to find out, and she actually did the compiling of the results for Canada to find out why Canada's score was so poor. Welcome to you both.
Great to be here.
So today we're going to talk about combating systemic sexual harassment in the military and whether parliamentary oversight can make a difference. And I just want to start out with what I would consider a bit of a rant, which is to say that I wrote an article or a briefing paper for the Westminster Foundation for Democracy a couple of years ago, talking about public accounts committees, which of course you don't need me to tell you are committees that look at the reports of the Auditor-General, committees in the legislatures and parliaments that look at the reports of the Auditor-General. And I was saying that, bearing in mind that I also work on this topic internationally, one of the things that I said was that public accounts committees need to go beyond the sort of typical partisan back and forth and start looking at systemic issues like the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, or climate change plans, or national priorities in which all parties can try to get on board. Yes, that's a little idealistic. I totally admit that. But I think in the case of systemic sexual harassment in the military, the question really is, there was a report released by Justice Arbour last week. Can Parliament play more of a role in overseeing the implementation of the recommendations that came out of her report? We saw the Shawn report released in 2015 with very few recommendations implemented. So is there a role for Parliament in ensuring that these recommendations get implemented? Shawn Murphy, former chair of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts, let's start with you.
Yes, I think, Jeff, there's a major role for Parliament to play in this whole issue. If you read not only this report, but some of the previous reports that have been issued, really there's two overarching issues that have to be addressed. And one is transparency, and the second one is civil oversight. And I know they're putting in place another mechanism as part of the Arbour Report, but really you can't replace Parliament, and it's really got to be, the accountability has to be to Parliament. Now, whether that's the Public Accounts Committee or perhaps it might better be rested with in the long term with the Standing Committee on Defence. But these recommendations, the 48 recommendations, 17 of which the Minister has said that she will be moving on immediately, I believe, in my opinion, how it should be handled, that the Standing Committee on Defence really should be having probably meetings every 3 or 4 months with the Minister, the Chief of Staff, and also the Deputy Minister of Defence. Have them all there and just how are they getting along with this report? It's a major report. It's very striking. So that we want follow-up and they want oversight by Parliament. It's extremely important. And that's probably one of the reasons why it fell down before, because perhaps the Parliament could have done a much more robust job.
Carol, what about yourself?
And, maybe I'll just step back for a second and explain a little bit more about the Public Accounts Committee, and also the role of the Auditor-General in that construct. Because, I'm totally on side with everything that Shawn just said. And in terms of the role of Parliament, it's critical. There is a huge structure already in place to make sure that there is accountability and transparency. So it only works if it's done right. So you do end up with the Public Accounts Committee. The reports of the Auditor General are referred to that committee. And so if the Auditor General's looked at something, then the committee has, and through Shawn's leadership and others who have chaired that committee, they've developed the skills to know how to follow things up. They know how to deal with reports. They know how to question witnesses. And they know how to find out from the Auditor General, what did you find and what would you see being improved? So taking that into this particular example, and maybe we'll get into a little bit more about what already has gone to the Public Accounts Committee in that area.
That's right.
But with the new report coming out, the Arbour Report, and the need for that follow-up, there is the skills are in place at the Public Accounts Committee. The construct is there for the Public Accounts Committee, but they do tend to focus on the Auditor General reports. Now, that's not necessarily a restriction anywhere else or in other places, but the federal Parliament has tended to stay within that, but they could go a little further. So could it go there? Yes. Would it be effective because they have the right skills to do the follow-up? Yes. Is it the right subject matter area? There's other opportunities in other places. But what you may find in taking it to another committee, they wouldn't actually really have the experience and practice to take it to are we making sure that the recommendations are being followed up? So it's a little bit of my quick answer is it should go somewhere within Parliament. It should go within a committee. I love the idea of it going to the Public Accounts Committee because I think they could do something with it. But it probably has to go somewhere else as well.
So I'll just take one step back, and for those listeners who are not necessarily, we're sort of a little club of Public Accounts Committee groupies here. But for those who are not familiar, just to say that a couple of things. First of all, so as Carol was saying, the Public Accounts Committee typically looks at reports of the Auditor General. In this particular case, when it comes to systemic sexual harassment, there actually was an audit done of inappropriate sexual behavior in the Canadian Armed Forces in 2018, and we'll definitely get back to that. As Shawn mentioned, if there is not an audit report, that the Public Accounts Committee probably will not touch it. It will be something that another committee like the Defense Committee would be likely to touch. And I have put out some feelers to sitting MPs to get some understanding of where they might want to put the report. And hopefully we'll be able to report back on that in the near future. So, but as Carol, you were saying that the challenge is there's a new culture in the Public Accounts Committee. And that culture is very much that they're used to asking questions. It's not so much a legislative committee focused on passing legislation or examining legislation or examining government performance, but rather looking at systemic issues like this. I guess, why don't we just start with the Public Accounts Committee, because in this case, there was an audit of inappropriate sexual behavior in the Canadian Armed Forces in 2018. It was examined by the Public Accounts Committee in February 19. The committee made a series of recommendations. Many were designed to report on the government's progress in reducing inappropriate sexual behavior. Let's talk about how that went and whether the committee could have done more. Carol, I'll start with you on this because I think you've made some reference to the work of the committee.
So, it's a great question. Obviously, if things have continued to be a problem, then something could have done better. It's, a little bit of the proof is in the pudding. So you end up with there was a report provided to the committee. The department officials would have answered those questions. By the way, the Public Accounts Committee functions in a nonpartisan way. It's there to make sure that things get fixed. It attempts to the best of its ability to stay away from partisan politics. It's not about the policies; it's about how well they were administered. So, if there were problems that continued past the report, then I'd say it could and should have gone further. Um, and I can mention now, or we can get back to this. But one of the things that is, if you look within the structure, once the audit report's been done, the organization that's been audited goes back in and through its own either internal audit group or another mechanism will go in and do their own follow-up so that they can figure out where things are going. And in this
Good point.
particular case, that 2018 report that you referred to that the Auditor-General's office did, the Department of National Defense in two time frames, April and then December of 2020, went in and did an update themselves. Now, one of the things I throw out there is how things can improve, and I won't. I'll ask you to ask Shawn. Just I don't want to take things out of order, but at the same time, I'm sure you've experienced times when a department comes before the committee, and it sounds pretty good. It's like, yeah, we've done that. We're, yeah, nothing here. Like, and I suspect, and I didn't go through the full Hansard to see exactly what occurred at that meeting, but I suspect that there were indications from the ministry. They tend to say, yes, we agree with the recommendations and we're on it. So if
Yeah.
that's the case, then it should have been delved into further to make sure that that was indeed the case.
Over to you, Shawn.
Well, I think one of the primary functions of the Public Accounts Committee, and I should add there has been a lot of improvements over the last 15 years in this regard, is follow-up. Because at one point in time, it was basically the ministry come in with the deputy, and there was a lot of aspirational promises made. Not always, but in some cases, when you look back 2 years down the road, nothing was done. But the way it works now, and it's been a few years since I've been there, but the way it works is an action plan is filed by the department, assuming that the recommendations have been agreed to by the department. And there really should be, and I believe they do a better job of following up. Perhaps they didn't in this case to the extent they should have because of COVID and other reasons, but there has to be a follow-up done by the committee staff, and if there's any indication that there's slippage, then they call the people back before the committee to get an explanation. But that follow-up is so important, and if it's not done, things can get off the rails very, very quickly. So no, there's this report. It's very important, and she's done a tremendous job, but a lot of things have been said before. There's been numerous reports by Justice Fish, by Justice Madame Deschamps, but internal reports, external reports, and there is some repetition here. So I think we're at a point where Parliament really has to take this very seriously, and I would suggest, as I previously stated, that it probably should be a very regular report from the three senior individuals with our Defense Department before Parliament. Now, what committee it goes to, that's a detail that can be worked out among themselves. But I would like to see that when the minister should be called right away, because the report is just out there. She has publicly stated that she is immediately moving on 17 of the recommendations. Get her, the chief deputy, before Parliament, but tell them at the meeting that they're coming, and schedule it, that they're coming back in 3 months' time, and then 6 months' time. I think that's what should happen, because some of the previous reports that were issued. And some of these are major cultural changes. That's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take work.
Cultural changes in the operation of the committees, for example.
No, cultural changes
in the military. Yeah.
Jeff, can I jump in just for a second? Well, just, I mentioned those two updates that were done by the department, but the other one was in September 2020, the internal audit group within Department of National Defense did an evaluation of diversity and inclusion. So, what also you talk about, the audit report. So it looked at a broad sweep of issues, and then you look at the various other reports that have been done since then, and the most recent one, and they're covering the waterfront. So where do you start? And you got to really deal with, okay, so what's the root cause of the problems that we're seeing? The recurring problems, they're not all fixed, they're cultural in nature, as you point out, Shawn, and it's a big shift within the department if you want to see change. So they picked a particular area and delved into it in depth, and diversity and inclusion, and looking at it from that one lens. So each piece of the big picture is going to require some action within the ministry at a very detailed level on every single piece, and it's a lot of work. So you do get into, it's easy to lose traction on change because you're putting in a lot of new practices and you're doing it at the depth of the culture of the organization. Totally agree with Shawn that follow-up has to be regular and frequent, and it also has to expect some movement, but be reasonable in terms of how it gets there, without getting so prescriptive and so analyzed that like nothing happens, because you can always show some improvement. So yeah, I've seen many different comparable situations where a big in-depth change is required, and you've got a shelf just covered full of reports of how to do it, I've even seen ministries where they end up hiring a whole unit within the ministry just to follow up the reports, which isn't necessarily getting at the heart of the problem, which is we need to look at this from the holistic perspective of the entire ministry. It has to be bought into by, we talk about tone at the top, by the minister, by the deputy minister, or whatever other senior officials.
Yeah, this is fascinating stuff, and I think we all know that the practice of the Public Accounts Committee at the federal level is something that we can, that is exported abroad, that's shared abroad to other countries that share the Westminster tradition, that most low and middle income countries don't have strong internal audit functions. And we could certainly point to Canada as having, at the federal and in many cases the provincial level, strong internal audit functions. Yet when it comes to systemic issues, and it's not just sexual discrimination, it's living conditions on reserves, it's the conditions of retirement homes that we saw during the COVID pandemic, that these don't seem to make a dent, that these bodies and these institutions don't seem to make a dent, which I think is a problem. I don't really have a question that follows that, just a statement. Shawn, did you want to add something?
No, you're quite right. There is some issues, and of course, some of them die in the altar of federal provincial negotiations, and there's different reasons. But yeah, there is issues that have been long-standing. Boil water advisories and indigenous reserves. There's a whole list of them that could use improvement. And but in fairness, and some of these issues are being worked on, and it's. I believe in this situation that we're talking about, we have in place a minister that's got a reputation of getting things done and doing things. So I think it certainly shows it's a priority with the government.
Yeah, and it's interesting though that now Justice Arbour, of course, it's not necessarily her role to prescribe how the government or our institutions are going to review the implementation of recommendations. But having said that, she did make a couple of recommendations that an independent monitor be appointed, But the only recommendation she made with respect to Parliament was that the minister should advise Parliament if the department plans not to introduce certain recommendations. Why do you think Parliament was so far from Justice Arbour's mind? We're talking as if there's a real role for Parliament. Why do you think that she didn't necessarily see that? Shawn, I'll go back to you to start on that.
Well, Parliament alone will decide its agenda, and this, for any parliamentarian looking at this should be front and center on their own personal agenda, and this is something that Parliament should take ownership of. She may not have mentioned Parliament, but she certainly mentioned the whole area of civil oversight. Civil oversight not only in the operations, but civil oversight in the investigations and of wrongdoing. So that, to me, strikes at the very heart of Parliament. So Parliament really has an obligation, in my view, to jump right in here and to provide the necessary, because they're the interface between the public, to the House of Commons, and of course through the House of Commons to the public. And there's no greater oversight body than Parliament. I know she did mention this external I forget the name they called it, but that's not going to displace Parliament.
External monitor, external reviewer.
External monitor, yes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What would need to change, for example, within the Defence Committee? Because the Defence Committee is not set up like the Public Accounts Committee. No other committee of Parliament is set up like the like the Public Accounts Committee. What would need to change within the Defence Committee for them to be able to systemically, on a long-term basis, monitor the implementation of recommendations from Justice Arbour's report?
Well, perhaps I'll take a crack at it and turn it over to Carol, but my opinion would be a very systemic look at this. And the worst thing they can do is have a hearing with the minister and the chief and the deputy, write a few recommendations, forget about it. I think it has to be a continuum, and they have to be scheduled meetings every 3 months, 4 months over the next 2 years. It's a serious issue. It's an issue that has been reported on by many individuals previously, and it is a cultural issue. And the military, it's insular, and we have a great, in this conversation, we can't say we have a great military, but there is issues that have to be resolved. And perhaps they haven't kept up with the values that we see in a progressive and pluralistic society, and things have changed. So that culture has to change, and it's not going to be done overnight. It's not going to be done by next Friday.
No.
It's going to take time, but that time has to be very, very rigidly monitored and followed up. And if it's not, things slip. The military will get busy. There'll be another engagement. There will be another outbreak somewhere in the world, and focus will disappear. Not disappear, but it will lessen. So the only way, really, if Parliament is not involved, I can see the probability of substantive change not being made, or not being made as quick as it should.
Carol, what are your views on that?
So, yeah, I mean, when you get around to Parliament has an absolute, it has an obligation, let alone just a role. I mean, it has an obligation to make sure that the improvements take place, and the mechanism they use, it could vary. The idea of an independent monitor. I wonder what that looks like in the end, because when you think about some of the issues that have arisen across Canada, where either an independent office was set up, so it can be an office of Parliament, like the Auditor-General's office. I mean, there's ombuds people across the country. There are advocates for child welfare. There are senior advocates, and so on. And it's like where something is so systemic that it requires that kind of devoted attention. but it's outside of the organization. So, and I keep looking at this particular situation. You say, okay, well, first, we're talking about ministry. So it has its own structure and it has its own internal mechanisms to make the change happen. And that's where there has to be political will to make the change. I did see we had some situations going on in British Columbia that required structural change. We did an audit of it. It was in the mining sector. So you end up, it's a big ministry, but it needed some structural changes that start at border on policy. So you end up with, is the structure change a policy change? And then the Public Accounts Committee stops on the line of policy. Like it's not there. They're looking at how well something's been administered. In the case of something very significant that needs to change, there may indeed be a policy component to it as well. And the government and the minister are really going to drive that charge. So back to, but does Parliament have a role? Absolutely. And I guess that's where I separate. We talked at one point about should it be in the Public Accounts Committee or another committee, and agreed it'll be Parliament to decide what mechanism they put in place. But from the administration perspective, absolutely it should be Public Accounts Committee. But there's a policy component to it potentially, because you may have to do some restructuring and do something quite different, and then Parliament can step in a different way.
We need to wrap up in a couple of minutes, but I think, Carol, you've raised a recommendation which could come out of this discussion, which is really that, one of the problems with Parliament, why didn't the Public Accounts Committee hold a follow-up hearing since 2019? Well, there's been successive minority governments, there's been prorogations, so Parliament is not functioning on a regular, it functions, but, obviously during prorogation and during elections, it's either suspended or dissolved, and you've got new members of the Public Accounts Committee. The staff can continue to do some work, but they're not going to be overly proactive because they take direction from the committee. Does there need to be some kind of agency, or does one of the officers of Parliament need to be tasked with regular follow-up on systemic recommendations that go beyond the Auditor-General's report? Is that what's really missing in the system? Shawn, I'll let you have the last word on that, if you want to comment on that.
Well, I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily recommend another agency or person. I believe there might be some extenuating circumstances here with COVID, with the two elections, with the prorogation and everything else which you've mentioned. But the Public Accounts Committee should be able to follow up on its own recommendations, and they have staff, and I believe they do, and I'm just not sure what happened in this particular case. And I think you alluded to some of the reasons, but the report still exists, and that they certainly, whatever happens, the Public Accounts Committee should call the respective individuals back before it, and just ask them why, if they haven't followed the recommendations, and I can't comment on that, but if there's been any slippage, what are the reasons? Because those are, I guess it's, 3 years now. So whatever happens, the Arbour Committee, Public Accounts Committee still have their own report that they issued, and if there was not, if the department did not do what they said they were going to do, and I'm assuming that the department, and I don't know this for a fact, I'm assuming the department agreed with the recommendations of both the Auditor-General and the follow-up recommendations from the committee. If they did agree, then there's an issue.
I think we'll have to leave it there for now, but I want to thank you both for a very constructive discussion. I think hopefully we can provide those that are working in this area or continue to work in this area with some food for thought on how to more systemically review recommendations and follow up on them. I want to thank you both, the Honourable Shawn Murphy, former Member of Parliament and Chair of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts from House of Commons, and Carol Bellringer, who's the President and CEO of the Canadian Audit and Accountability Foundation. Thank you both very much for your time. This has been a great discussion.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
And I'm here now with Marie-Soleil Tremblay, who is a full professor of accounting at the École nationale d'administration publique, which is the University of Public Administration in Quebec City. Professor Tremblay, welcome to Politics and Public Finance.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here. As you know, the first segment of our podcast today, we had the former member of Parliament and former chair of the Public Accounts Committee, Shawn Murphy, and Carol Bellringer, who is a former Auditor-General of the provinces of British Columbia and Manitoba, talking a bit about the role of Parliament, the prospective role of Parliament in monitoring the implementation of recommendations arising from from Justice Arbour's report. And we talked a bit about the need for Parliament to be more involved in reviewing systemically some of the other kind of endemic issues that we have in our system. For example, poor living conditions of Aboriginal people or Indigenous people. This segment, we wanted to talk about the Open Budget Survey, a survey of 120 countries of budgeting practices, which Canada fared pretty poorly. Why don't you tell us a bit about what the OBS is about, and maybe talk about your role in compiling this year's survey data?
Sure. So the Open Budget Survey was created by an organization called the International Budget Partnership, which is a community of analysts, organizers, and advocates whose goal is basically to advance budget systems so that they work for people rather than special interests. And so they have the financial support of public and private organizations worldwide. And they were able to generate data, advocate reform, and build skills and knowledge so that basically everyone, not just the people in Parliament or experts, but everyone can have a voice and track how money is raised and spent. So the Open Budget Survey uses internationally accepted criteria or principles to assess transparency. So does the public have access to central budget information? Then there's the public participation. So are there formal opportunities for the public to participate in national budget processes? And then there's the budget oversight by institutions such as legislatures and national audit offices. And so it was first developed in 2006. Canada joined in 2017. So this was the third time. It's done every 2 years. And so this was the third time we participated in the 8th edition of the survey. And for the first 2 times, I was acting as a peer review. This year, for the first time, I was the researcher in charge of answering the survey, and it's also reviewed by a government official. And so basically, it's a tool for citizens who should have the right to influence how public money is raised and spent, because the public budget is an expression of social values and should aim to reduce poverty and inequalities. And so there should be a space for meaningful engagement with poor and marginalized communities. And so basically that's how I got involved, and I think doing some great work and able to compare across different countries.
And I'm actually interested in how many hours you had to put in, because it's a very comprehensive survey with over 100 questions. How many hours would it take for you to complete your work on a survey like that?
I think I'd rather not count my hours, but it's probably I would say close to a month of work to get and there's a little bit of back and forth, and I have to say that this year because of the specific context. So I think that normally it would probably be less than that, but because there was a specific context due to COVID, it was a lot more work, because usually you can kind of go and see, what was done 2 years ago, any changes. Right. This year, that wasn't the case.
Right. So Canada scored 52 out of 100 with respect to budget oversight, which is really its involvement throughout the budget process. And then 31 out of 100 on budget transparency, which is really about, we've had discussions on fiscal transparency before on this show, which is really the availability and timeliness and accuracy of documents that are being provided by the government generally, or by national audit offices related to the budget process. What struck you in the work that you did on this survey? What struck you as some of the sort of the key issues that arose?
So I guess in terms of transparency, which was the biggest drop, and I guess that, when you're working in this kind of organization, what you want to do is have a positive influence and for the scores to increase. And so this year there was a big drop. Normally Canada would be at the head of the class. So basically, the first two surveys, we were 71 out of 100 in terms of transparency, and that put us, 15 or 16 out of 100 and almost 20 countries, and mainly due to COVID-19, Canada's score went down to 31, and so right now we're ranking 89 out of 120 countries, and what struck me is that when you compare it to the average, the global average for all these countries, which is 45, and for OECD countries, which is it's 66, and you look at what it was in 2019, it was 45 and 67, which means that our drop wasn't part of a global tendency across the world. And so what struck me is that our systems, even in Canada, can be fragile. And I do understand that in times of pandemics or emergency, governments need to take measures, and some of those measures included bypassing legislatures, relaxing procurement procedures, and not seeking citizens' input. And I guess that, even if shortcuts can feel justifiable because of the context of uncertainties, and everybody says we need to react quickly, it makes it more difficult for citizens and representatives to understand what governments are really doing and how effective they are. And while it can be thought that circumstances justify reduced transparency, I'm thinking that it may be even more important in times of uncertainty. So I guess there's a lesson for the future in this year's budget. The fact that Canada was, it's not like if everybody had gone down, then we would have said, it's kind of normal, but that wasn't the case. So I guess that's what surprised me most.
Yeah, and just on that point, Professor Tremblay, it's interesting that Canada did not table a budget in 2021, which was the survey year, but clearly many other countries did table a budget, and they had a similar COVID-19 situation going on. So that would certainly have, I imagine, would have really affected their Canada's performance. Similarly, the enacted budget, which is the budget that is tabled that reflects any changes made by the legislature, of course, would not have been tabled either, or not been published either, because there was no annual budget. But so I recognize that. The other thing I wanted to talk to you about that I thought was very interesting, and I've had this conversation with the parliamentary budget officer before on this podcast, is the mismatch between the budgetary estimates and the annual budget. Namely that, and it took me years to understand this, but namely that when parliamentarians are reviewing the budget, which is often tabled in April, it's a political document that spells out the priorities of the government. The budgetary appropriations that they're reviewing at that time are not aligned with the major programs of the budget. The appropriations are really covering the last budgetary period. I know that you know that, by the way. I'm just sort of explaining it for the listeners. But
I'm very impressed that you understand it, because in all honesty, I have a PhD in accounting, and I'm still struggling, because there are changes going on, because this has been mentioned by many people and parliamentarians, of course, also. And so there were in June 2017, the House of Commons approved a motion where the main estimates could be tabled after the budget proposal. So that kind of made sense. And in February 2018, the president of the Treasury Board announced a new approach that was supposed to improve the integration. But because of COVID, we didn't have that budget, so I wasn't able to look at it. But preparing for today, I went and I kind of checked with the last budget, and you see that there are efforts, but as you said, I'm an accountant. I like it when things match, and I can see which number comes, and it's still difficult. So I imagine if it's difficult for you and I, it must be quite difficult for citizens to actually understand it, and parliamentarians too.
And the problem is that Parliament abandoned that pilot project. It expired and it was not renewed in this Parliament. So they are no longer, that's my understanding, they are no longer undertaking that practice. So we're sort of back to where we started, which is very important, very unfortunate. And I do notice that all three reports that you referred to, 2017, 2019, and 2021, actually recommend that Canada align their estimates to the budget document. I spoke to someone that I really have a lot of respect for, who definitely has an opinion that I don't share, in terms of saying, look, the budget document itself is not that important, because it's the appropriations that are important. So the budget is just a political document. If you missed a year, big deal. How do you feel about that?
Well, again, if I'm involved with this organization, it's because I believe that citizens should be able to understand, where the money is coming and where it's going. And I believe in transparency. And so I don't know if you've looked at the different Appropriations Act, but we're very, very far from something that citizens can understand and follow up on. And you want citizens to be involved in this aspect of our democracy. And I think we need to give them tools. And so I think the budget is one of these tools, but it's got to be done in a more comprehensive manner for citizens to get involved.
That makes sense. And I was a little surprised to see also, given the work that Canada's doing around gender-based analysis plus, which is really about inclusion and including women and intersectional groups in policy, and making sure that the policies have a positive impact, that Canada was, I don't want to say judged, but that the report found that the government didn't take concrete steps to incorporate vulnerable and underrepresented groups in their own budget consultations. What do you recall about your findings on that matter?
Well, I think two elements of context, because I agree with you. Canada is actually a leader in that sense. Absolutely. And so the first, Canada's score is 26, which is higher than the average of 14 and the OECD average of 21. And second, I think that it's probably due to a methodological issue. So, when you're doing a survey like this, you need to have elements of that you're able to fact check and that are comparable. And so sometimes you need to draw the line. And we know that the Minister of Finance does consultations and provides, a space for Canadians to talk with him and his team. It was now her team. There's surveys online, in-person consultations, and other than Indigenous people that was mentioned in the press release, there was no clear indication that they actually reached out to vulnerable or marginalized populations for input in the consultation for budget 2020. And because I didn't have proof points, it doesn't mean there were no efforts. But I think that, it could be as simple as for government to document those efforts in the future. And I think that if they did that, it would also give a voice to these populations and help Canadians better understand their reality. So I think that, part of it is probably here a little bit of methodology, because I do agree that if you compare, we're doing some great things to actually address these issues in the budget in Canada.
And I, of course, provided you with a bit of a preview of some of the issues I wanted to discuss. One of the issues that I forgot to mention in that preview was the fact that, of course, I'm not throwing a trick boomerang at you or anything like that, but the House of Commons, of course, conducts its own pre-budget consultations with it, which, if you look around the world, that is fairly unusual that the legislative branch is conducting during the formulation phase its own pre-budget consultations. But one of my understanding is that one of the problems is that by the time that report of the House of Commons is released, the government really has no time to incorporate that into the budget process. Do you want to talk a bit about, or into the actual annual budget? Do you want to talk a bit about your findings this year in that regard?
Well, I mean, I think it is that's one of the things we question is the actual timing. So something is done, but it's probably, how can we do it probably in a more timely fashion so that the input can actually be used, because, as you said, because of the timing, it makes it a little bit difficult when you understand the just the sheer work, incredible amount of work that's done to get all the information into the budgetary process. We're thinking that the input might come in a little bit too far to have an impact. That being said, I think there are many ways. And some people I talk to in government say, we're continually in contact. Our workers speak to people, so we're it's not like we're somewhere doing our work without but it's more about having a formal process that's in place, and I guess just doing it a little bit sooner would probably help citizens be involved and feel that their involvement actually translated into specific actions.
Makes good sense. Just a couple of other questions I wanted to ask. One thing I noticed, and this is pretty much standard for Canada, or for the House of Commons, for the Parliament of Canada, is that there is really no monitoring of the implementation of the budget throughout the year. Many countries do undertake monitoring of the budget after it's been adopted. Do you want to talk about why that's important, and what do you think Canada's missing in this regard?
Well, I think that a lot of attention and media attention is paid to, when there's the executive budget proposal. That's
Absolutely.
when all the lights are there, and
what shoes the minister is wearing, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But we have very little concern with the actual spending, and it's not because there's not information. I mean, the Canadian government on his website has monthly, quarterly, mid-year reports. There's a lot of information that's there, not necessarily easy to digest and understand, but a lot of information is there. And so I guess the recommendation is that there's a committee who would actually, do the work and publish a report, again, for citizens to understand how money is actually spent in real time, which would promote accountability from those who are doing the spending or not. Because, sometimes people think that a budget is just to limit the spending, but I have issues when we're supposed to be spending money somewhere and that money's not being spent. So there's kind of the process is done so you don't go over what was authorized. But in Canada, there's nothing when you're not spending what you said you were going to be spending. So I think that would be a way also to give a voice to citizens, but you need to give them this information for them to have a voice.
Yeah, the previous government was quite famous for that. I mean, the current government in its older iterations was famous for lowballing the surplus, of course. We know that. That's why the PBO was created. The previous government was famous for making all kinds of political promises, and getting a pat on the back for that, but then not actually implementing them by holding back the money. So I do recognize that that's an issue. And I think also in areas, for example, if there's been serious changes to our macroeconomic forecast, for example, and we have budget cutbacks are required, or sorry, I should say the forecast. Maybe we're not getting the revenue that was projected. That could increase the deficit. The parliamentary monitoring of those situations would be very effective. I guess the last question I wanted to ask you was, and I talked about this again with the parliamentary budget officer, in light of the fact that Canada skipped a year in tabling the budget, and so many other countries didn't, according to the Open Budget Survey, including countries with a lot less resources in Canada. This is going to be a long preamble, just to warn you. In light of the fact that, for example, we were all left guessing as to whether the Minister of Finance was going to table her annual fiscal update in the fall, her fall economic update in the fall. Is it time to consider legislating these requirements, as so many other countries do?
Well, I mean, honestly, I never thought that, I was actually very surprised that Canada didn't publish a budget. And had you asked me before, I would have said, well, no need to do this, no need to legislate something that's, of course, never going to happen. Now, with that being said, as I said at the beginning of the podcast, I think we need to learn some lessons here. And maybe, one of these lessons is, in times of uncertainty, there are certain things that need to be in place. Of course, the numbers were not going to be as sure. Anybody who's had to do a budget in the past 2 years knows that, there were many changes involved. But I think that, in a democracy, I think that that's something definitely that we should make sure that we don't look over again.
So do we legislate it?
Well, that's I guess the way to do it. But again, the legislator can also say, well, this year we're not sometimes what you're going to end up doing is not respecting, you're going to bypass legislators. So legislators. So I mean, it's kind of a chicken and egg thing, right? But I think that it does send a message that this is not something, that this is not something we want to do again. So I think in terms of signaling, that would be a good thing. But I think that hopefully this report, will demonstrate that in times of uncertainty, not everyone had that same attitude as to say we're not gonna publish a budget document. Now there was a document that was ready, and at that time the Minister of Finance said, I'm not gonna put this forth, knowing that it doesn't stand anymore. So I guess did some of the countries still put a budget knowing, and maybe they got their points, but it didn't mean anything. So I do understand, but I'm hoping that as a top of the class country, Canada could do better and adjust in real time, so that Canadians have a better direction as to where they're headed.
Yeah, and I'm just speculating, but obviously putting out a budget that the government knows is likely to change quite significantly is one way of maybe sticking their necks out and being subject to partisan criticism by opposition parties, and that may have been the reason. But again, many countries managed to table the budget, so who knows what the reason was. I think we'll have to leave it there, but Professor Tremblay, I really want to thank you for your time. This has been a really good discussion, really interesting conversation about Canada's performance in the Open Budget Survey. Hopefully when you do the work again in 2 years, we'll find a significant improvement.
You know what? I'm sure there's going to be great improvement, and just because of circumstances, and also, I'll be, working with government to try to encourage them to get a citizens budget out there, to have a document that,
Mhm.
just a less technical version. Because if you look at provincial, for example, provincial budgets versus the federal budget, my students, I make them look at this every year, and everybody says, we don't understand anything in the federal budget compared to the provincial budget. And these are master's degree students. And so I'm thinking, I think there's a lot of room for improvement, and we could get our score up, with minimal effort and just a little bit of will.
That's a really good point. Professor Tremblay, Marie-Soleil Tremblay, Professor of Accounting at the University of Public Administration, l'École nationale d'administration publique. Thank you so much for your time. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
It was great talking to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And that is our podcast for today. Politics and Public Finance is produced and sponsored by Huge Impact Marketing. Wherever you're listening to this podcast, be sure to subscribe. I'm Jeff Dubrow. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you again soon.